Good morning. Welcome to Core Services and our Core Belief series, Why It Matters. Today we're going to be discussing 3 key board actions that should happen at every board meeting. Before we get started, a little bit about Core Services. Core focuses on audit and review services, primarily of condos and HOAs. We have over 40 years of combined experience working in the CERA industry. And we also offer advisory services for boards, board meeting observations, anything that helps the board become more effective and efficient at doing their oversight role. So the 3 key board actions are really important. These are the ones that make up the bread and butter of your oversight responsibility. So the first one you'd want to make sure you do at every meeting is review and approve the year-to-date financial report. That means question reported year-to-date expenses. The monthlies are okay. I'm not a big fan of monthlies myself, but you can go back to this and you can look at that year-to-date. So if you're in June, you could argue maybe that most of your contracts might be halfway through. So you could look at that and compare that to where you're actually at, and are you really at that 50% of the expected expenditures? If you are, I think everything's fine. The other thing you're really looking for is make sure management is not submitting additional expenses. It does happen. Oftentimes there's a perfectly good reason for it, but nevertheless, you want to make sure that the management contract is not getting out of control, because sometimes they do have additional costs in there that need to be managed. Follow up on and review all the actions on owner non-payments. By the time you're meeting, you could be a meeting 2 weeks, 3 weeks after the financial reports have been prepared. Make sure that when management's presenting that receivable number, you know how many of those have actually maybe come in since then, how many days late they are, and if really how many of them have actually gone to the lawyer for collection. And obviously, if you have a more complicated balance sheet, such as you have special assessments, fixed assets, things like that, make sure that the numbers look right to you, especially special assessments. When the time comes for the audit, remember now we're talking 3 or 4 months after the end of the year. If you notice a problem with special assessments during the year and we get to the end, it's a lot of effort to try to clean it up. So make sure you watch it and you ask good questions about the special assessment balances. The second key step to take is ratify the expense approvals that happen between meetings. In almost every jurisdiction, email approval by the board of appropriate expenditures, those that in the bylaws are required to be have board approval, such as maybe any one expense over $2,500 is not part of a pre-approved contract, or maybe you're over budget in a category, so you're voting on each one of those individually. It's acceptable to do that, but it should be unanimous. So if one board member is going, I don't know if we should do that, then the approval should not take place by email. If it's going to have to be debated, it probably needs to be done during a board meeting. So when it comes down to the board meeting, you can have just a list of it on your agenda that's called under a expenses to be ratified, and then list them out. Just under that one, list out what the expense was, maybe who it was paid to, and the total dollar, and then you just vote to ratify that particular agenda item. I move to approve all of the expenses we approved since the last meeting. Second, discussion if any, and then vote. The vote should be unanimous. If it's in there, should have already been pre-approved by everybody. So this is just a formality to make sure it's in the meeting minutes. Third step: make sure you review the reserve projects. This one can get out of control really quickly, and it's often a great big pool of money that you're spending, and it's a tempting target for people to want to pad their expenses. Management should be looking at it. You may have even hired a construction manager to oversee this, but still review the year-to-date actuals on that project to what was planned. It's a good oversight step. Any projects that were completed before you sign off and you put that thing to bed, make sure all the punch list items are signed off on. Again, you don't want anything hanging out there, because if somebody noticed that what looks like a defect and it doesn't go get corrected, you run the risk that that defect causes bigger problems down the road. So make sure everyone's signed off on it. Management, construction manager, a board committee if you had one assigned to it. And yes, always compare that final bill, the final total payments, to what you had originally planned. It has two purposes. Number one, just make sure that your planning for reserve projects is working well, but it also gives you the information to give back to your reserve specialist to make sure that the reserve component gets updated for the actual real costs. They work in their world. Reality is something entirely different, so when they go to plan the next one, they know what number to start with. They're not using some pie in the sky super efficient number that doesn't really exist. And then finally, make sure you approve any and all reserve payments that need to be paid out at that meeting. Review the invoices. Make sure there aren't any questions from management or the construction manager related to that particular project and that payment. And you can then vote to transfer a certain amount of money out of the reserve investment account into the reserve checking account, and then write those checks. We have discussed that before. Obviously, two signers on the account, two signatures on the check, but the reserve account should be under the control of the board, not management. So why does it matter? Well, so remember, board is not responsible for the day-to-day operations. They're responsible for oversight. So you want to make sure that spending is under control, that you're holding management accountable to that spending plan, and that you're making sure that management addresses collection problems as they pop up. You don't want to find out 3 months later that something that should have been filed wasn't. Reserves are a separate fund entity. So again, you'll notice I separated them out in this. Deal with the operational issue, then deal with the reserves. So you want to review it separately, and management should report it separately. It's a separate fund. Commingling is dangerous because it can mislead you into thinking that things are probably going well when they're not. Everything should have a budget. So every reserve project dealing with a component should have a budget. So you want to always be comparing where we're at in relationship to where we thought we'd be at. And always keep in mind that it's forest for the trees. The management is just a lumberjack. They're out there, they're supposed to cut down trees, but it's the trees that the Bureau of Land Management said they could cut. So you've gone through and you've surveyed the area and you've said these 6 acres can be cut. You don't particularly care which trees. They know which trees they're supposed to cut, but you don't want them going off reservation. You don't want them going off and cutting into, right next to a stream perhaps, which is a salmon spawning ground. You've marked it out. You've said no. You don't want to be out in the field with them. That's not your job. Your job is to tell them what they can and can't do, and then make sure they did it by supervision and oversight. So always keep in mind, be at that 50,000 foot level, but make sure that the numbers come in such a way that you can review and hold management accountable to it. Hope you have found this informative. As always, you can find us on the web at www.core.acct.com. You're more than welcome to click on our contact form, send us a message asking us any questions you'd like. We respond for free. We're here to help you and be a better resource for your association and help you as a board make more effective decisions. Thank you very much. We look forward to presenting to you again.